Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Hunt Institute's Early Efforts webinar for July. It is great to be with you. We're going to talk about technology today, but we're going to give it just a minute or so for everyone to filter into the room. So in the meantime, and I will make sure that the settings are set appropriately, invite you to jump into the chat and introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and where you're tuning in from, and we will get started here in just a minute. Reading these introductions is always one of my favorite parts of doing these. I always like to see who is furthest away. I see a couple. Saw Ontario. Saw, I think, two from the UK. So great to have you, regardless of where you are tuning in from, either in the United States or across the globe. It's great to have you here for this conversation. My name is Dan Worry. I'm the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Hunt Institute, which is located in Cary, North Carolina. The Institute was founded in 2001 by Jim Hunt, who was the four-term governor of North Carolina, and we are an education policy support to the nation's governors and state lawmakers primarily. We support those policymakers all across the education continuum, from prenatal on up through post-secondary and workforce. But here, once a month on our Early Efforts series, we talk about my favorite part of that continuum, the earliest years. And so we're here to talk about early childhood, and again to talk about today the role of technology. Boy, it has it just becomes more and more ubiquitous in our lives, and it raises interesting questions about sort of both the opportunities and maybe some of the challenges or risks presented by the use of technology. And we've got a fantastic panel today to help to talk through some of those issues. Excited to be joined by Dr. Victor Lee, who is the director of the Data Interactions in STEM Teaching and Learning, or DISTL Lab at Stanford University. Also by our good friend Chris Perry, who is Executive Director of the Children and Screens Institute of Digital Media and Child Development, and by Dr. Deborah Rosenfeld, who is Senior Research Associate at the Education Development Center. It's great to have all three of you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to have this conversation. And we'll jump in just a minute. I want to mention three quick housekeeping items. First off, later in the hour, we will turn to you. We'll try to share some of your questions with the panel. If you have questions, invite you to drop them into the Q&A function down there on your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen, and would distinguish that from the chat. As you can see from the chat, it moves very, very quickly, and if you post a question in there, it is likely to become lost in a period of seconds. So if you can use the Q&A specifically for questions that you'd like to pose to the panel, that'll help us to keep track of them. Also, please know, as always, that our Early Efforts series is closed captioned for the hearing impaired, and so if it is something that you would benefit from, please know that you can access the closed caption settings down in the Zoom bar, also down at the bottom of your screen. And finally, a question that we are asked frequently: is this session being recorded? It is. All of our Early Efforts webinars are recorded and end up very quickly on the Hunt Institute's YouTube page. page. And so to find this session and many, many others, both in the Early Effort series and other series that the Institute hosts, all you need to do is go to YouTube, enter Hunt Institute in the search bar, and it will bring you to our account page, and you will find lots and lots to listen to while you're on your morning drive or walk or exercise bike. Lots of great content there. So with all of that out of the way, why don't we jump into a conversation? And Chris, I'm excited to maybe begin with you. You know, it's no secret, you and I, as longtime early childhood colleagues here, you know, technology is sort of a hot button issue and always has been in early childhood, particularly as related to this question of screen time, right? That we, you know, the question of how much young children should even be exposed to screens. And it was interesting that prior to the pandemic, in particular, there was a lot of conversation around the concept of virtual preschool, for example, and a lot of pushback on that concept. That there, you know, there's no such thing as you know, sort of a technology that would replace in-person preschool. And yet, lo and behold, then along comes COVID, and a lot of children actually experienced preschool virtually for a couple of years. So interesting conversation. Want to let you definitely maybe begin by sharing a little bit about your organization, Children and Screens, and its role, but then maybe talk to us a little bit about what does the evidence suggest around the effects of technology with young children.
Great to see you, Dan, and nice to be here, everyone. Children and Screens is a research and education nonprofit on a mission to help children lead healthy lives in a digital world. We work to educate parents and caregivers, as well as professionals who work with youth, about the impacts of technology and digital media in the lives of children and adolescents, to advance and support interdisciplinary scientific research to improve our collective understanding of this issue, and to connect policymakers and leaders with the evidence-based information they need to make sound decisions to protect children and families in an increasingly digital world. And the example you gave of digital preschool, virtual preschool, I think is one of probably thousands of examples of the ways in which children's lives have become increasingly digital. So to pivot now a little bit to those effects of digital media on children and child development, I thought, of course, I'd start with early childhood. I know your audience is very familiar with early childhood development, but I'm still going to repeat that it is a period of such rapid development in all domains that every interaction and exposure the child has matters. For example, what interactions with others are happening, what is going on in the environment, and what children are actively doing themselves are all going to have effects, positive and negative. Thinking through this lens, it's essential to always consider the timing of digital media exposure and the type of digital media interaction and the other activities that may be displaced by being involved in a digital activity. For very young children, 2 years old and younger, they need hands-on exploration and social interaction to fully develop their cognitive, language, motor, and social emotional skills. And screen-based media cannot provide that to them at the same level as in-person interactions do, especially very young children who are still mastering symbolic understanding, memory, and attention skills. In fact, it's not until the second year of life that there is any evidence that children benefit from media for learning. And even that requires direct facilitation and reteaching from an adult. So for all young children, high amounts of screen time, especially without adult guidance or as a passive activity, is unambiguously detrimental to their learning and development. And restrictions or limitations on screen time for children 5 and under should be encouraged. Research has found effects across cognitive, physical, and social emotional domains. So just to break those down for a second, the cognitive effects in early childhood are based on the fact that it is such a sensitive window in which we develop these fundamental skills and abilities like attending to tasks, switching between tasks effectively, and inhibiting behaviors. Greater screen time in infancy, this is 12 months and younger, can predict poor attention and executive function at 9 years old, and even more screen time at 5 years old is associated with attention and concentration issues and hyperactivity. Physical effects. The physical activity remains important in children's health. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends children 1 to 5 get at least 60 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, with a good portion being more structured physical activity. Screen time should not interfere with that 60 minutes. Screen time displacement for peer play relates to worse fine and gross motor skills in 1 to 3 year olds, and illustrating the often interrelated nature of all child development. Toddlers who follow the AAP physical activity and screen time guidelines had better executive functioning than those who did not. Social emotional, this highly digital media world, it can promote some pro-social behavior and social skill building. And it's important, though, that the digital media doesn't replace in-person interactions. Screen time displacement often relates to poorer social development. Finally, in the communication area, greater screen time consistently relates to poorer language development. Greater duration, poorer quality, and earlier onset screen time exposure lead to poorer language skills. These effects are mitigated by things like co-watching, but they are still making a negative impact. I'll finish on a slightly happier note by letting folks know that there are well-designed and age-appropriate programs that do show some benefits for children 3 to 5 years old, but those are really, few and far between, and you have to be very careful what you're using and for how long. And I like to think back to a paper Kathy Hirsch-Pasek released in 2015 that shows or talks about the 4 pillars of the efficacy of media on digital media on learning. And those are promote active learning, engage in the learning material, make sure that the material is meaningful and relatable, and includes social interaction. So thanks for asking about the Institute and letting me start with some of these effects that technology can have on young children.
Chris, thank you. And I want to follow up on some of that a little bit later in the hour. But right now, let me invite Dr. Deborah Rosenfeld to join our conversation. Deborah, you are at the Center for Children and Technology at the Education Development Center. You've written a good bit about the role of technology with young children. So what appropriately is that role? And where are parents and early childhood providers wise maybe to recognize the limitations of technology?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yes, I'm from the Education Development Center and a center there called the Center for Children and Technology, where we think a lot about these questions about how to best design digital media that promotes learning and how to support children, caregivers, educators in using and implementing and integrating those resources in the most effective ways. So I really appreciate everything that Chris set us up with there. I don't want to repeat it. I just want to say that I wholeheartedly agree and think those are critical points to keep in mind. And maybe I'll take the tack of just the reality in which we sit of how ubiquitous technology and digital media is, and how much it's often used as a babysitter, as entertainment. And the hope is for it to be used educationally. And there's certainly places and contexts and opportunities for that. But I just want to couch some of what I'm saying in the actual reality of how it gets used, so that we can think in terms of what's unfolding in front of our eyes. So one of the things that Chris mentioned is just, and in our research, we do a lot of thinking about mediating the learning that could come out of digital media and resources. And we think of co-viewing, we think of talking about and drawing out from these resources the important concepts, ideas, the way that the characters interact, all those kinds of things. And those are very critical, but it's also an assumption about the synchronicity of those things happening. Like a caregiver is sitting beside a child watching a show, playing a game. all of that. And that, in terms of the reality of how things play out, is not the typical situation as much as we hope it will be. And so I think it's a nice opportunity to remember that, and I think COVID kind of brought this out for us too, that asynchronous opportunities are there as well. And so when we have high quality resources that are engaging kids are going to naturally bring that to conversations with adults, to conversations with friends, to their imaginary play, to the playground. These are going to be the topics that they're talking about, the things that are interesting to them, the characters that get incorporated into what they're playing, and the dolls' names and that sort of thing. So there are plenty of opportunities to draw out learning, even when we're not at the same time doing that co-viewing. That co-viewing can asynchronously transpire, over conversations in different ways. And similar to that, I kind of like to think of digital resources as not that different than everything else that's going on in kids' lives. So just like books, toys, trips to the park, imaginary play, being creative with a friend, all those kinds of things, they all have their own opportunities for learning in them that happen as kids engage naturally in play, in hands-on learning, in the ways that Chris was saying are so important for kids to learn. But the adults in their lives, the caregivers, the educators, they can really leverage those things. And that's why I was making the point about asynchronously. It can happen at any point to enhance and expand on the opportunities that those things present. So sometimes I think it's just a helpful thought experiment of, like, when we think about media, and we usually are talking about digital media when we say that, like, think of it as a book. If we think about books, it's rare for us to question, are kids reading too many books? Are they getting their hands on the wrong type of books? Though that is unfortunately a question that comes up as well. Are they not getting physical activity because they're reading too much? We're placing like an inherent value on books that makes us have a lot less of the fears around it. And so digital media is certainly different, but also can be viewed in a similar way, just even for a thought experiment of the value of it, in terms of digital media can take you to new places and present new ideas and new cultures, new traditions, new vocabulary. And when it's used and the things are drawn out of it in conversational ways, in order to empathize, in order to connect to experiences one has in their own life, to question things, to have natural curiosity take you to the next step, all those kinds of things. When you especially have an adult who's able to listen attentively, to follow the child's interest, to follow the child's questions, to notice misconceptions, to notice ideas that may need some tweaking, to notice when, in the media they're watching, there may be an interaction that you don't agree with, and talking about that. Just so many opportunities for conversation that supports language development, supports social emotional development, supports connections and relationships. All of these are so critical to learning. And those are the things that we typically say digital media can't replace, those face-to-face interactions, those hands-on experiences, which is completely true. And if we see these as tools, as materials in which we can still have those interactions from as launching points, or from as just other strategies and resources in that milieu, I think it's an interesting way to to consider all those kind of issues. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good place to pause, since we have a whole conversation ahead of us, and I look forward to talking more.
That's great, Deborah. Thank you. I want to remind everyone, if you have questions for the panel, please do begin popping them down in the Q&A function down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But Victor, I want to bring you into the conversation for what is, to me, one of the most timely parts of this conversation, and maybe one of the most interesting. And that is that, with the emergence of things like ChatGPT and other systems, it seems like all of a sudden, even though this isn't a new conversation so much, it seems like just, here, even in just the past couple of months, we've advanced in our conversation around artificial intelligence or AI in ways that are simultaneously both really kind of exciting, but also maybe a little bit ominous in some cases. And I know you've done a good bit of work in this space. Talk to us a little bit about AI and young children. How is it likely to impact, maybe both in the short term, right? How might tools like ChatGPT impact the classroom experiences or other things for young children, but also how is it likely to impact their lives in the longer term as we see it starting to accelerate?
Well, first off, thanks for having me as part of this panel, Dan, and that's an excellent question. AI has really occupied a lot of the conversation lately, and ChatGPT being sort of that chatbot technology that you can type and engage in conversations with and have write anything on request, whether it's an essay, poem, or play script. Has been incredibly fascinating, but it's really important to keep in mind is that while we keep on referring to that as artificial intelligence, that AI actually covers a very big swath of technologies and not just this chatbot, ChatGPT technology. So AI includes the things that recommend what Netflix shows or what music should come up next in your queue. AI includes the map applications that will find the best route for you to drive to get them from point A to point B. AI will also be recognizing your friends in the photos on your phone and auto-labeling them and doing object recognition, as well as with the voice assistants and other forms of technology that we don't necessarily think of as being as lifelike as ChatGPT. But what I'd also want to emphasize is that artificial is a big word with respect to artificial intelligence, and that it is not doing what humans do. And when we think about what's going to be happening with child development and childhood experiences, that we really keep in mind that the position we should be taking on this is that it is not there to, nor is it ever going to be capable of replacing what humans do, especially with respect to how we support the development and growth and autonomy of our kids. So when I think about what's coming in the future with this, I think as a technologist, it's incredibly fascinating, but I also would like to echo the points that I think my colleagues here on the panel have said. It is not a replacement. It is not a babysitter. Those are probably the most negative uses that we can think of. Where we see these as interesting media that have some potential is within a co-viewing or sort of joint interaction paradigm in moderation. When it is something for parents and children or caregivers and children to talk about and to have some interesting joint experiences where they're both focused on one another, as well as the technology. So not as a digital babysitter. When I think about what sorts of potentials we're looking at is that if we think about kids growing up with this, and this is just part of the ecosystem, then they're going to be looking to how adults interact with, treat, and behave around this technology as models. And so that's one thing we're going to be really needing to be mindful about. So if we treat AI as all-knowing or always having the right answers or preferable under certain circumstances, those are models that our kids are going to be picking up. There are also situations in which how is the AI presented to us? So by default, a lot of voice assistants have female voices and act in sort of assistive capabilities, in sort of serving capabilities. And as a parent, I've made the deliberate choice to change what was the voice persona of my technologies because I want to make sure that even some of these messages about who provides support or what sorts of personas provide support are highly varied for my kids. So I think there's going to be a lot of subtleties that we'll want to think about with respect to how is it that we interact with these technologies and what is it that kids are seeing with respect to our behaviors. Are we fully engaged with these technologies rather than with them? The kids will pick up on that. Do we take everything that comes out of a query from such as a chatbot or some other tool that provides rapid information as being absolutely true and correct on face value and don't think carefully about vetting it or making sure that the information was not a hallucination or a bit of misinformation? The kids will also be picking up on that. So I think that we need to look at this as it's a fascinating technology. It could be wonderful media in moderation for joint engagement between caregivers and youth, but that has to be done very thoughtfully and carefully and not as a replacement. And there's going to be a lot of subtle messages and models that will be expressed, whether we are being very intentional or not. And that's a really important step for us to be taking. As we look at this sort of landscape of technology, it's important to understand that a lot of these AI technologies that have gotten people very excited exist and work because they are trained on massive amounts of data. And it's massive amounts of data about us that we have produced. And that's going to be raising a lot of really important questions, I think, for children, especially with respect to privacy and their autonomy with making some of these decisions in terms of what information is stored and retained and used about them to sort of shape some of these interactions and who benefits and who sort of profits from that experience. So, as I said before, as a technologist, I think it's really neat and fascinating technology, but also as a parent and someone who works with children, it is certainly not going to be a replacement to the extent that it can become fodder for meaningful interactions and meaningful conversations between human caregivers with children. I think it's going to be our most promising direction, but we need to be very thoughtful with respect to how do we ourselves interact with it, as everyone will be taking a page from that as they see this unfold over time.
Victor, as we're thinking about this, given the kind of early childhood focus of our conversation and this audience, are there ways that you see even the current iterations of AI as being useful, either to children or to their parents and caregivers in ways that you'd want to lift up?
Well, with respect to parents and caregivers, one of the interesting things with something like ChatGPT is that it's able to provide information on demand in a form that's a bit easier for us to sort of read and interpret than what search engines have done in the past. And so as something that can provide some information upon request, such as what might be some really interesting activities I could do with my kids, that can be an additional resource available to caregivers in there. However, there is this phenomenon of hallucinations where these technologies, because they're not human and they're not making these sorts of careful judgments on truth or accuracy or validity, will provide misinformation. And so it should become a resource in the mix of many resources. Now, with respect to children, again, I think that Chris has been very articulate with respect to where we should be drawing some lines on what are the most productive kinds of experiences at what ages, and when to make sure that human caregivers are centrally, deeply involved in the development of physical, emotional, cognitive skills. There can be potential with some of these expressive and storytelling capabilities to create media for caregivers and children to interact with together. And so those things could be especially interesting, but again, not as a babysitter nor as a replacement. Rather, we want this to sort of augment the kinds of things that we already know are rich and helpful, whether it's augmenting some additional ideas for activities or things that I might look to as a caregiver, because this is a new form of search and information provision, or as interesting new media to jointly engage with and to support the kinds of play, imaginative play, narrative storytelling that these technologies could be used for, would be on the more promising side.
Yeah, and it sounds like a healthy dose of skepticism and critical literacy is important for adults at this point.
Adults and children, indeed.
Chris, I want to turn to you and Deborah. You, as you were wrapping up your opening question, you talked about sort of the bright spot being, that there really are some, though maybe not all, programs, for example, that have been shown to be beneficial. And I know you talked about Kathy Hirsch-Pasek's article a little bit and some of those kind of overarching pillars. But what advice would you have in practice to parents or to early childhood providers that are assessing programs on a case-by-case basis, what should they be looking for in practice to distinguish between something that really has some educational value and maybe something that doesn't?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's imperative that systems are set up to support the selection and implementation of evidence-based programs that are established with clear pedagogical goals, and that they follow developmental guidelines. I think many of your audience members today are providers, or caregivers. And when you're going out and exploring a new tool, you should really be considering what we already know about developmental and learning needs. And for the purposes of the population you're trying to serve, ask yourself, how does this tool support those needs or that child's needs? An example we go back to what Kathy Hirsch-Pasek told us about those 4 pillars. Does it promote active learning? Is it engaging but not distracting? Is it making meaningful connections to the child's experiences? And does it include social interaction? So you want to be looking for opportunities in technology tools that extend or enhance existing educational practices, not simply opportunities to replace or ease with the child's emotional state. It's really, really basic common sense. We know how humans develop. They need to connect with other humans. The younger you are, the more important those connections are for learning and self-regulation. So if you're introducing technology into the dyadic relationship, be sure you're not interrupting these important developmental goals that the child is trying to achieve to move on to the next developmental goal, because they stack, and you're scaffolding all of these internal tools and resources where technology really hasn't demonstrated that on its own it can do that, but it can be used in small doses if carefully selected to extend learning and enhance learning.
I'll just jump in to add, there was a nice setup. I can build on what you said without repeating it. So those 4 pillars are a great framework, and I think it's super helpful because no one can ever say what the need of a particular provider, caregiver is, and what the particular skills and needs of the child in front of them are. But having the framework of paying attention to the needs and experience and context of the person in front of you is critical. So I would say, you mentioned learning goals and content. Is this resource something in line with the content, with the learning goals that you have? And is this resource providing something that can't be provided off the screen? Does it do something that traditional methods cannot? And therefore it enhances, it supplements, it integrates well, it offers a practice opportunity, whatever it is, that has something additional and different than a traditional method that you would rather do first and foremost with really young children, because that is their most natural way to learn. So in some of our work, for example, with preschoolers, we've developed some apps that we think provide that kind of scaffolding above and beyond to supplement and integrate with the hands-on experiences. For example, an app that supports preschool teachers with collecting and representing data, which is often an area where preschool teachers will spend a lot of time gathering and representing data into graphs or charts or that sort of thing. So to speed up that process, to focus the instructional time more on analyzing the data, looking at the types of questions that can be answered by data, looking at multiple graphs and similarities and differences and that sort of thing. So it wouldn't replace creating, object graphs or picture graphs or that sort of thing. You would do that as well, but having a tool at your disposal that can be integrated with those experiences and point out sometimes how a graph can be misleading when you make it in real life, because you're putting beach balls next to tennis balls and counting more beach balls because they're bigger. But in a digital space, you can control for some of those kind of variables. Or similarly with like a ramps kind of activity, kids are going to play and experiment with the surfaces and the inclines, but sometimes in a digital environment, you can speed up and control for those factors more. And you could supplement that kind of experience. So you're looking at the learning and the content, but you're also looking at what above and beyond can this digital resource provide, and how does it integrate and mesh with the hands-on and active learning and playful-based learning that's happening that supports development. The other thing I would say, and I think all of this incorporates into good pedagogy, the way kids learn, the learning sciences that Kathy Hirsch-Pasek really grounds a lot of her work in, they all apply to designing and selecting high quality digital resources as well. So you want them to promote social interaction. You want there to be levels and challenges and ways that you get feedback. You want to have different ways of engaging with the content, whether it's audio or visual or touch screen, whatever it is, different ways that kids of different skills and needs will engage with it. The last thing I would add is cultural responsiveness. So making sure that if you do introduce digital resources or media into that environment, you're paying attention to it being representing the children that you're working with, their experiences, the way they look, the languages they speak, the way that they interact with their parents, the ways that parents use media with their children in different contexts and cultures, all those kinds of things. The final thing I wanted to say is just that those are all great guidelines. Common Sense Media is a wonderful place to go that has done a lot of research and gathered resources and will give you good information about why they're effective or for what purposes and that sort of stuff. And in general, public media, so like, the PBS kind of things that we know of, good old-fashioned traditional public media, which is of very high quality, is research-based. And in terms of AI, I was thinking when Victor was talking about the different ways that AI shows up, one of them is these algorithms of showing the next video for children. And so if you want a closed environment where you don't have to worry about what's going to pop up next for your child, PBS Kids, those kind of controlled environments, you can view media, watch games in their apps without having to worry about what AI is going to pop up in front of them next.
Great. Let's go ahead and jump into some of the audience questions here. Chris, I don't know if you still have it handy, but I would say that my quick scan is that about 20% of the questions in the chat so far are about Kathy's article and the 4 pillars. I don't know if you have that title handy, but they're asking sort of for the citation. I know you actually already dropped the link in the chat. Could you share one more time the name of that article so that people could find it?
Yes, as I said, it came out in 2015 and it's called Putting Education in Educational Apps, Lessons from the Science of Learning. And I did drop the link to the actual article in the chat. I can do it again since it was many comments ago. But it's probably one of the stronger pieces to help everyone, put the corners on the page of like how to choose high quality technology, resources for young children.
Right. And a question for all of you, and maybe Victor, you can start here, because I was going to ask you about the regulation of AI and how and whether we need to regulate that going forward. But Surinder has a great question in the Q&A that I think takes that question maybe even to the next broader level. She's asking, how do we ensure that policy moves fast enough to restrict harmful technologies that might be heavily advertised or pushed to families and parents? And also, as an aside, Chris, she's asking, what is being done to help inform parents of those 4 pillars that Kathy raised? So, Victor, maybe you could start. What do we need to regulate AI?
I would say yes, with the asterisk that, as I'd mentioned before, AI really speaks to a very broad swath of technology. So we're going to have to be a bit more precise when we start to introduce regulations about which sorts of technologies and techniques we're speaking to. So that way, these are things that will actually work and make sense and be able to be implemented in a meaningful way. Having something that changes the way recommendations work is going to be a bit different than the way that a chat interface works, for instance, and the same with object recognition or image recognition. The other is that, while it is tempting to hope that the private sector will sort of self-regulate, in order for these things to actually work and to make sure that the proper incentives are in place, we do need forms of regulation that will come from us collectively speaking and articulating what is important and where are our boundaries for what we find acceptable and not acceptable use, with respect to, for example, privacy. Just as much as we regulate medications or foods, and one of the analogies I oftentimes use is, we now have technologies that can provide and manipulate information very rapidly and at a seemingly low cost on the consumer side. It's kind of like the processed food revolution, where now we have an abundance of cheap, easily distributed foods, but it doesn't mean that it is as healthy or as desirable or should be replacing what we have elsewhere. And there are regulatory structures that ensure that the proper information is made visible and available, that guidelines and recommendations are provided for best practice, and that there is incentive for research to be done, and that marketing is done in responsible and productive ways. And so as we look towards AI regulation, those are things that we do need the public sector and government to be taking the lead on. In part because we have a lot of taxpayer-funded research that has helped us to understand where are some of our best directions and best recommendations on this. And this is a way to operationalize that and make sure that any sort of startup or technology that enters into this has equal playing time with respect to other organizations and can actually do things in ethical and responsible ways. Part of this will also require a mass awareness that lawmakers, policymakers, nonprofits, and leaders all need to do a bit of work to understand AI a bit better and how it works and why it works the way that it does. So knowing, for example, that data are instrumental in this and where those data come from and how those data are acquired and what role they play and what they can and cannot do, and where and how biases exist, whether it is in the data or within the larger algorithmic system. Those are things that we need to better understand so we have thoughtful regulations and things that would actually work and be actionable with that. So I do think that knowing things such as AI really refers to a number of different things, how data are involved, how we are contributing to that, and what sorts of decisions we should be empowered to make. And where we want to draw some lines on things that we do find acceptable and not acceptable with respect to our privacy or content that we find appropriate or relevant are going to be all quite important with that. So to answer your question, should AI be regulated? Yes, I would say, but it needs to be done thoughtfully and carefully, because bad regulation can be just as harmful as no regulation at all.
Victor, thanks. Deborah, I want to let you jump in on that. Do you have thoughts on how we might help policymakers to keep up with this rapid change?
I would love to have an answer to that. I think Chris and her organization sound like they are an amazing way of doing that. I have not heard of that many similar kind of organizations doing that kind of work. So I'd love for her to chime in on that. But I would like to just add before turning it over that I think it's getting this information to policymakers, to educators, and to parents is very challenging in all of those realms. And part of what I think is important is realizing that those pillars can apply to any kind of screen time. We do differentiate between screen time when we are talking about educational, and I think I might have seen in the Q&A, a question about like, are things actually educational and how do we know? Related to regulation, there's no regulation with any of this. Like there are no standards. When people say educational, I think it's something like 500 million apps are listed in the App Store as educational, but like there's no one giving a gold star rating. That's not happening. So that's why these kind of pillars in this information is so critical. But if we step back from that a little bit and say all resources can extract out of them some of those principles of being engaging, of finding meaning, of making different connections to it, I just think about, like, this is going to be a random example, but for anyone who can relate to their kids learning to read through Dog Man or Captain Underpants, you probably have like banged your head against the table thinking like, how long do we have to read these books before my kid's going to go on to something else? And yet they get them to be readers, right? We're thrilled that they're readers. And I don't mean to disparage, apologies, Dave Pilkey. They're great books. They get a lot of kids reading. They capture the imagination. And if you're willing to engage with your kid about why they're exciting and what's interesting about them and what new vocabulary came up and what questions they have, you may then be able to direct them to a similar kind of book that might bring them to the next experience, to the next experience. They may be on the playground imagining the scenarios and creating new characters. They may be able to empathize with different kinds of animals. They may, you know, whatever it is, all those kinds of things can still happen regardless of the gold star rating or the non-existent gold star rating of the quality of the media. It's certainly easier when we have these features built into them, but even when they're not, there's a lot more onus on the adults who are doing it, which is why it would be so helpful for this information to reach the people to be able to have it. One quick last thing I'll just add is that I recently saw a study where they tried to do some of this in terms of responsive parenting. They tried to help parents to understand the ways that they might respond to kids when they are sharing ideas and have back and forth conversation and build on the concepts that they're exploring and build on the vocabulary and all that. And they were using technology in terms of sending text messages to parents. And that kind of nudge didn't seem to do all that much because these are really complicated interactions to foster. But then there was another study that showed that a simple sign in a grocery store or a laundromat that prompted a parent to ask a question or a child to engage in like a sorting or pattern activity with fruit or with laundry caps did actually make a difference. So you never quite know where those things are going to come from, but we don't have to think necessarily in terms of like organizational and paper and presentations in terms of getting the information out. They can pop up in unexpected ways of like a sign at the grocery store is all I was trying to say in that example.
Chris, I want to let there's a question here that I think is tailor-made for you, but I want to give you kind of the last word on that question too. Anything you want to weigh in on the
yeah, quickly on this policy point, which is a very important part of what we do at Children and Screens. And Victor and Deborah have done a really great job of already talking pretty extensively about what AI is. But I do want to underline 3 times just how much I think caution is necessary, absolutely necessary, and that regulation should require a safety first mindset, especially when children have experiences with these tools and potential impacts that before we unleash it on the public and even into classrooms, it really is important that we understand better what the impacts are. And I want to echo what Victor mentioned, which is that we need more transparency to understand how the algorithms are trained and what data they're collecting, particularly for scientists, so they can objectively assess the data and potential impacts. And I really think that protections around how the data of individuals are, including children, are being used to train and inform AI programs. So it's a really complicated policy area. We have to be on our toes, and we need to really dig in more to what some of the best guidance would be.
Absolutely. Let me pose this other question. Kate has a fascinating question in the chat about what she's calling a hierarchy of types of screen, and saying that she had read something recently about how mobile phones, for example, might be the worst type of screen when compared to television or tablet screen. Seems like maybe there's a hierarchy from largest screen to most personalized screen. And I'm wondering, first off, if you have any thoughts on that, and if so, you know, might that have something to do with what you hit on earlier about the sort of appropriate role being interactive with adults, right? That maybe the tinier and more personalized the screen, the less opportunity to have that kind of supplemental conversation?
Yeah, so it's not really that important what type of screen is being used, but smartphones, we'll just start right there, are very challenging because they're designed to constantly bring you back online with more notifications and alerts. So you're always constantly carrying them around in your pocket. So they're the addictive nature, the way in which it's calling out to the reward center of your brain is quite constant. Whereas, say, a television may not quite have that to you. And one other key point is the way that marketing is so fully integrated into social media apps. Children, especially young children, cannot distinguish between what is perhaps programming and what is marketing. Whereas if you're on television, those ads tend to be a little bit more distinguished. Like, remember a magazine ad, you had to turn the page, oh, that's a magazine ad versus an article. Social media has blurred that line in ways that are really problematic. And so it's not the screen, it's what you're actually viewing and the way it's calling out to you that is particularly challenging.
All right, so many great questions here. Let me see what makes sense in terms of the next order. And I'm going to jump to this one, Chris, too, just maybe as a follow-up to that last question. Ingrid is asking a question around the sort of virtual reality screens, like the Oculus, the head, the screens that are now kind of encompassing the full line of sight. Any thoughts on their use with young children?
I'll speak a little bit to it, is that
Sure.
when you see those technologies, they're not actually even built for young children's bodies. Adults who wear them will find them a bit cumbersome and heavy and can be a bit unpleasant after extended period of time. As someone who generally finds technology exciting and interesting, I think there can be some places and uses for it. But again, going back to sort of some key themes, it's not going to be a replacement for some of the things that we know are going to be meaningful and powerful, and that is backed up by the literature, which would involve social interaction and actually interacting with the physical world. It's very different to sort of pick up a virtual object than actually picking up the real physical object. It's very different to have a conversation with somebody and have to read all of the facial and bodily and sound cues and understand the bigger context you're in than to see a virtual avatar of the person. And so understanding that these are artificial, that these are sort of proxy stand-ins, is that there may be a few cases where it can do a few things that will have some uses, but again, it is not going to be the replacement or a desirable, cheaper version of what we know is going to be effective. And, as humans, we did not sort of come into being by being optimized for these particular technologies. We came into being with optimization for being around other people and with this physical world that's around us. And so sort of our own hardware is really best treated and fine-tuned within that space. So, I think for one, they're just not really built for young people. And then even for those that may have some sort of use cases, it's still going to be a rough stand-in for something else, and we'll need to be very selective with respect to what kinds of situations that are useful, because it's not a replacement. And we do know that real interaction, social interaction, are going to be very key ingredients in anything being effective for child development.
Butcher, thank you. A couple of questions that maybe we can combine together. Interesting how nicely they go together. Liz is asking a question in the chat about whether there's any research on why parents are so likely in some cases to rely on screen time. And then an associated question, how do we offer parents with low incomes and maybe therefore really major time constraints sustainable alternatives to overusing technology as they're raising young children? Deborah, any thoughts maybe?
Sure, I'll jump in first. I'm not aware of research about why parents rely on screens, just anecdotal life experience that we all rely on screens. I mean, I think we've talked about it as in terms of the babysitter, but like even myself in a very different socioeconomic status, being in the field of this research, rely on screens as a babysitter. That is a reality of my life that I think most people, if they were forced into it, would probably admit to doing at some point, because we live busy lives, and screens, they're never late, they keep your kids occupied, all those kinds of things, right? So I think that's why at the beginning I tried to couch some of this of like, I do want to echo, and I don't want to undermine in any way the things that have been said about the cautions and the need for not displacing other interactions and all those things. There is also this reality that this is how they are used. And I think that's why I wanted to draw out some of the important ways in which, even though kids might be using these and watching things and all of that, playing games, we can still extract out of that meaningful interactions out of the moment, asynchronously, over the dinner table, in their imaginary play, when we do get to play with them, all those kinds of things. So I think that people use screens because it's an easy way to keep kids occupied and safe when they need to get other things done. And I also just want to say, again, I don't know the research, but in my lived experience, these things cross socioeconomic lines. This is, I would say that it's not a unique problem of income that leads to people using screens as babysitters.
One thing that I would add into this conversation is, and again, it's not clearly a sort of research line, although I think there'd be a lot of good arguments for this, is that there's this tendency for technology to be treated as increasing efficiency so we can do even more. And so it becomes kind of this accelerant that we get more information, so now we can deal with even more information faster. And so this constant notion that the technology should just further accelerate and increase the more is something that we're, from my vantage point, gladly seeing a bit of backlash to, where what I would think is going to be a much more balanced approach is, can the technology take on some of the responsibility so I can get back to doing the things that are important that need me, which would be making time to have the relationships with people, to have with my child. And I know that, it's a very complicated world, and there's a lot of policy things that make it so that's not an equitable option for everybody to be able to do. But this recognizing that there is this sort of pressure that a lot of the technology reliance to create and do more in the same direction that it's going, rather than to take on some of the responsibilities so I can actually be more present in the moment, is a paradigm shift that I think we as consumers, and also as policymakers, and as well as industry, can take steps to encourage and support. So I think that is going to be a very key piece of that. Now, with respect to different financial circumstances, again, this is where we find really tremendous gains and returns when we invest in public infrastructure and civic resources, whether it's the public libraries, subsidies for childcare, food banks and other resources, parks to play in. But doing those kinds of investments are the things that we care about, because it's our generation and our time that we value. And so making sure that those are viable and available, and not only to people with certain resources, I think is kind of an important collective investment that we need to make sure we keep foregrounded, because we want to stay back in touch with what is important to us as a people, as a culture, as many cultures, and to not get sucked into sort of this addictive more mentality.
We are almost at the top of the hour, but Chris, I want to give you a last word on that question.
I mean, it's really just an instance of wanting to underline empathy, the need for empathy, and we develop empathy through human interaction. We also children see their parents and caregivers as models. And so if you're using a device, if you're distracted by your device, you're modeling that it's okay to be on your device all the time. And you're also missing opportunities to connect in real time. So I think putting that as much as you can front of mind and trying to remember what these long-term effects are on children, not only directly when they're on devices, but watching adults be on devices are also interrupting their opportunities to develop. So everything that Victor and Deborah have said about the challenges, I agree with wholeheartedly. But I think it's fun to end on this point of like, it's common sense. Parents, kids, caregivers, they all do better when they put their devices down and interact in real time as much as possible and use technology as sparingly as possible, because in reality, we live in a digital world and we want children to be healthy, and it's all about balance.
That's a great way to close this out. I do want to end on one by responding to one process question that has come up repeatedly in the chat and in the Q&A, and that relates to whether the Hunt Institute provides any sort of documentation for continuing education credits. I know many of you need to document a certain number of clock hours, for example, for recertification or for childcare licensing requirements. We, because of the national and as you can see today, even international nature of this audience, we haven't been able to sort of proactively register that in a way that would meet the needs of all of our viewers. But that said, if some sort of documentation would be useful to you, please do send me an email. I've been happy in the past to provide letters and document your participation in these early efforts webinars, and I'm happy to do that. So feel free to drop me an email. My address is on the Hunt Institute website, and you can always reach me there. Want to thank our panel first and foremost, Dr. Victor Lee, Director of the Data Interactions and STEM Teaching and Learning, or DISTL Lab at Stanford University. Chris Perry, who is Executive Director of the Children and Screens Institute of Digital Media and Child Development, and Dr. Deborah Rosenfeld, who is a Senior Research Associate at the Education Development Center. Thanks to all three of you for taking time out of your busy day to participate here today. And thanks to all of you who are viewing today. We know that you have very busy schedules as well, and appreciate consistently your making this a priority each month. We are a little bit further into July than we usually would be, because our typical schedule would have put us right during the week of the 4th of July this month. So our next early effort session for August is actually fast approaching. It'll be on August 1st, and we will be talking about seeking solutions to the childcare crisis. This is a session that we are going to co-host with earlylearningnation.com, which is a project of the Bezos Family Foundation, and excited to be welcoming on Tuesday the 1st, Elliot Haspel, who many of you know as the author of the book Crawling Behind, America's Childcare Crisis and How to Fix It. He is also with Capita. Cheryl Oldham is the Vice President of Education Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and will be joining us, as will Marika Cox-Mitchell, who is the Vice President for Early Learning at the Bainham Family Foundation, and formerly of the National Association for the Education of Young Children. So we'll be talking about the childcare crisis and how to fix it coming up in a little bit less than 2 weeks. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again for taking the time out to be with us today, and we'll see you real soon. Thanks, everyone.